The crumpled, hand-drawn map that Pete Miles smuggled out of Los Baños internment camp held the key to freeing 2,000 Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mueller grilled the exhausted internee for an hour, and one detail electrified the intelligence officer. Japanese morning calisthenics at 6:45 a.m. left the guards unarmed. To understand how that map came to be, we must go back to the dark days of 1942 when the Japanese invaded the Philippines. It was January 4th, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Army marched into Manila, and for the thousands of American civilians who had built their lives in the Pearl of the Orient, the world closed in. Within days, armed squads went door to door, rounding up foreigners and herding them into Santo Tomas, an old university turned internment camp. Among those taken was Gerald Sams, a radio engineer who had narrowly escaped the bombing of Cavite Navy Yard. He and the others were told to pack for 3 days. Those 3 days would stretch into more than 3 years. The brutality of their captivity was established early. 3 British internees escaped by climbing the wall after evening roll call. Planning to sail to Australia, they were caught within 12 hours while buying supplies. They were beaten, court-martialed, and sentenced to death. On the morning of February 15th, they were blindfolded, made to sit on the edge of a shallow grave, and shot. A Japanese officer stood over them as they lay groaning and fired additional rounds into their bodies before ordering the grave filled. In May of 1943, 800 able-bodied men were pulled from Santo Tomas and sent south to build a new prison camp at Los Baños, 40 miles from Manila. Benjamin Franklin Edwards was among them. He had arrived in the Philippines aboard the Pan Am China Clipper just 2 months before the war, a Midwestern farm boy working as a mechanic on the big seaplanes, chasing adventure. Now, he was a prisoner, swinging an axe on a wood-cutting detail, studying the terrain beyond the barbed wire. The new camp was built on the grounds of an agricultural college, set against the slopes of Mount Makiling and the great expanse of Laguna de Bay. The barracks were woven bamboo with thatched roofs, and the guards patrolled with bayonets fixed. A year later, in April of 1944, a second wave of prisoners arrived from Santo Tomas, women, children, and the sick. Margaret Shirk stepped off the truck, carrying her infant daughter in her arms and her 3-year-old son at her side. She had given birth to that baby in captivity, and she had no idea if the man she loved, Jerry Sams, would still be waiting for her on the other side of the fence. In April of 1944, the 11th Airborne Division loaded onto troop ships in San Francisco Bay, bound for the Pacific. They had trained for months in North Carolina and Louisiana, learning to jump out of aircraft and fight as light infantry. Half a world away, at the Los Baños internment camp in the Philippines, Navy nurse Dorothy Still was already at work in the crude hospital, having been transferred from Santo Tomas months earlier. Margaret Shirk had recently arrived with her 2 children and found Jerry Sams waiting for her, his grin wide as he held their infant daughter. But the hope of reunion was tempered by a new darkness settling over the camp. In August, Warrant Officer Sadaaki Konishi took over as quartermaster and de facto commandant, and almost immediately he slashed food rations by 20%, then more, pushing the internees towards starvation. Dr. Dana Nance, a surgeon who had been interned at Baguio and was now at Los Baños, watched his patients grow weaker by the day. He performed emergency surgeries with no anesthetics using instruments he kept sharp on a leather strop. Konishi forbade the nurses from receiving Red Cross supplies and blocked local Filipinos from selling food to internees. Nance reported to the commandant that the daily caloric intake had fallen to 881 calories, less than half of what a human needs to survive. The Japanese garrison fed themselves 3,000 calories a day. Konishi's response was a promise: "Before I'm done, you'll be eating dirt." Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. On October 20th, 1944, General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte and announced, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The 11th Airborne arrived 3 weeks later, landing at Bito Beach under the roar of naval guns. They were thrown into the mountains to stop a Japanese division coming over the ridge. The terrain was brutal, mud, rain, no trails, and the fighting was close, often face to face. Lieutenant Colonel Henry J. Muller, the division's young G2 intelligence officer, sent his reconnaissance scouts into the jungle to find the enemy. Among them was Sergeant Terry Santos, a Filipino-American who had trained with the Alamo Scouts and could move through the bush like a shadow. The scouts brought back paybooks from dead Japanese soldiers, which confirmed the 26th Division was indeed crossing the mountains. Swing committed all 3 regiments to the fight, and the paratroopers pushed through heavy fire and human wave attacks. They had no heavy artillery, no tanks, only rifles, machine guns, and their own endurance. In the last days of December 1944, as the division prepared for the Luzon campaign, Muller interviewed a Filipino grower who had just traveled through southern Luzon. The man described passing a large prison camp at Los Baños, filled with American civilians. "They are in pitiful shape. They're dying," he said. That seed of information would not leave Muller. On the afternoon of December 6th, Muller received a coded message on a 2-way communications pad, a small booklet of number-letter pairs unique to him and General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief. The pad was no bigger than a field notebook, its pages thin and soft from handling. The message warned that a Japanese paratrooper brigade was going to drop on the Burauen airstrips at 6 o'clock the next evening. Muller decoded it and took it to General Swing. Swing dismissed it as harebrained. Muller disobeyed his orders and told Swing the source was Willoughby. Swing still refused to act. At exactly 6 o'clock on December 7th, the drone of Japanese transports filled the sky. Parachutes blossomed over the airstrip, and enemy troops landed among the American supply depots. The attack was poorly executed and caused only minor damage, but it proved that Willoughby's intelligence was deadly accurate. Swing said nothing to Muller about the incident, but the division staff was astonished. "How the hell did you call that jump?" they asked. Muller deflected, but his credibility with Swing was solidified. He now had the trust to push for something bigger, a plan to rescue the prisoners at Los Baños. In the early morning hours of January 7, 1945, the Japanese garrison at Los Baños pulled out without warning. Guards abandoned their posts and the camp commandant declared the internees free. The prisoners rushed to the flagpole, hoisting a hidden American flag as a scratchy recording of the Star-Spangled Banner played over the loudspeaker. For a week, they feasted on stored rice and traded with local Filipinos for fresh meat and vegetables. Men, women, and children who had survived on 800 calories a day suddenly had full stomachs. They believed the American army would arrive any day, but on January 14th, trucks filled the road outside the gate. Japanese soldiers dismounted, looking angry and tired. Konishi and the commandant had returned. The internees were ordered back to their barracks. The food they had taken was confiscated and rations were slashed to less than 400 calories daily. Konishi sealed the camp gates and let the hunger resume. Hope died in those first hours of the renewed occupation. On January 17th, a single rifle shot cracked near the northern fence. Dr. Dana Nance hurried to the spot and found a man lying dead in the grass. It was Pat Hell, a mining engineer who had slipped out to trade for food for a sick friend. He had nearly made it back, carrying a sack of coconuts and bananas, when a guard shot him 3 times, including 1 bullet to the head. Hell had been hit in the front, not the back, proof he was returning, not escaping. The doctor noted the wounds and had the body brought to the hospital. Later that day, Nance wrote a report documenting the shooting as a killing, not an escape. He filed it with the administration committee. The message was clear. Even trying to feed the starving meant death. A wooden cross was hammered into the ground outside the camp, marking Hell's grave. 10 days later, on January 27th, another man was shot crawling back under the outer fence with food. George Louis, a young Pan Am mechanic, took a bullet in the shoulder but did not die. He lay moaning between the fences, still alive. Nance and committee member George Gray rushed to the commandant's office, begging to treat him. The commandant refused. Konishi, standing nearby, ordered the wounded man executed. A Japanese officer drew a white-handled pistol and handed it to a soldier. A single shot rang out and Lewis's head exploded. He was dead before his body hit the ground. Nance's autopsy found 2 wounds, a minor shoulder injury that would have healed and an execution-style shot to the forehead. He refused the Japanese demand to falsify the report. Dorothy still helped wash the body, her hands stained with his shattered brain. 2 wooden crosses now stood near the camp, silent witnesses to a policy of murder. The internees knew that without rescue, all of them would soon be buried in that same ground. General Douglas MacArthur landed his spotter plane on the rough strip at Nichols Field, where the 11th Airborne was still fighting through southern Manila. He met General Joe Swing out in the open, ignoring the crack of sniper fire. MacArthur came straight to the point: liberate Los Baños and do it right. Swing gathered his staff, including G2 Lieutenant Colonel Henry Muller and G3 Doug Quandt. Muller had been collecting bootleg intelligence on the camp for weeks, and now that hoard of reports and maps became the foundation of the operation. Muller and Quandt worked side by side in a Spanish villa turned headquarters. They called in Major J. Vanderpool, the guerrilla coordinator who had been operating behind enemy lines for months. Vanderpool's hunters, ROTC fighters, had eyes on the camp, and they could guide any rescue force. The planners sketched a complex scheme. Paratroopers would drop east of the camp, Amtraks would cross Laguna de Bay with more troops, and guerrillas would screen the flanks. But they still lacked one critical piece: precise, up-to-date intelligence from inside the wire. Inside Los Baños, 3 men decided to provide that intelligence themselves. Benjamin Franklin Edwards, Pete Miles, and a young Filipino internee named Freddie Zervolakos had been planning an escape for weeks. On the night of February 18th, they staged a ruse. 1 man pretended to be ill, and the others helped him walk to the hospital. Once inside, they slipped out the back door and dropped into a ravine. Crawling under the barbed wire fence, they froze as a sentry post loomed just 40 feet away. No challenge came. The 3 men moved through the darkness into the woods, where armed guerrillas guided them to the camp of Romeo Espino, a local resistance leader. Miles volunteered to push ahead to American lines. Edwards and Zervolakos stayed with the guerrillas, ready to lead a reconnaissance team back to the camp. Miles traveled by banca across the lake and then on foot, eventually stumbling into 11th Airborne headquarters. Thin and exhausted, he unfolded a crumpled, hand-drawn map of Los Baños and began to talk. Muller grilled Miles for an hour, pacing distances, identifying buildings, marking guard posts. One detail electrified the intelligence officer: Japanese morning calisthenics. Every day at 6:45 a.m., soldiers not on duty lined up in fundoshi, traditional Japanese loincloths, and sandals, leaving their weapons stacked in a connecting room. Muller rushed to Quandt's office with the news. They changed the attack time from 8 a.m. to 7 a.m., betting the entire raid on catching the garrison, half-dressed and unarmed. To confirm that vulnerability, recon scouts George Scow and Terry Santos crossed Laguna de Bay with Edwards and Zervolakos. The 4 men crept to a hillside overlooking the camp just before dawn. At precisely 6:45 a.m., the Japanese filed out for their ritual calisthenics, unarmed and nearly naked. Santos watched through binoculars, memorizing the layout. Edwards pointed out 2 hidden machine gun pillboxes made of dirt vulnerable to grenades. Scow scribbled notes in a sweat-stained field book. The plan now had its anchor, the exact moment of Japanese weakness. Back at headquarters, Muller and Quandt assembled the final plan for Swing's approval. Paratroopers would drop onto a drop zone east of the camp at 7 a.m. The recon platoon would simultaneously attack the guard posts from the ground. Amtraks from the 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion would carry 2 companies of paratroopers across Laguna de Bay, roll into camp, and begin loading the internees. A diversionary force would push south on Highway 1 to keep General Fujishige's division from reacting. Swing approved without changes. George Gray returned to banking and watched his grandchildren grow up in the peace that had been so long denied. Benjamin Franklin Edwards returned to Pan American Airways and went on to enjoy a long career as a commercial pilot. Sadaaki Konishi was captured by U.S. forces in the weeks after the raid. Tried for war crimes, the executions, the starvation, the digging of mass graves, he was convicted and sentenced to death. In 1949, he was hanged. The camp at Los Baños is gone now, reclaimed by the jungle and the rice paddies. but the story of its liberation still stands as one of the most daring rescue operations in American military history, a moment when the plan, the men, and the timing all came together and the sky delivered.